Right, I think we should get started now. Hopefully everyone's joined us or joining soon. Hi everyone and welcome to you all. I'm Heather from RedDoor Press and I'm delighted you can join best-selling author Alison Booth in conversation talking about her latest novel, The Philosopher's Daughters. Now, before we get started, I've got some housekeeping to do. As I'm sure you know, Zoom can be a bit temperamental, so we're turning off all the videos and muting the sound for now. I'm delighted to say that we have a handful of speakers today. If you'd like to see them all at once, make sure you're in gallery view, click on the 3 dots on your tile and hide non-video participants. So that's hide non-video participants. There'll be an opportunity for questions at the end as well. So if you want to pop those into the chat function at the bottom of your screen, we'll collate them for later. Now, on to the launch. Alison will be introduced by Professor Deborah Mabbott, who will talk briefly about the book. Alison will then go on to chat about writing and the trials and tribulations of publishing in a pandemic, and with novelist and non-fiction writer Maggie Hammond. Finally, we'll take questions from the floor. The Philosopher's Daughters is the tale of 2 very different sisters, Harriet and Sarah, who travel from London to remote outback Australia in the 1890s. Their journeys, whilst different, are that of self-discovery for both women, set against a landscape of wild beauty. There is so much I love about this novel and so much to explore. Whilst we follow 2 very different women and their precarious position in society, we also see the injustice and violence experienced by Indigenous people, and I think that is no mean feat. But I think what captured me most about all was the powerful setting and atmosphere, the brooding landscape, the night skies, the heat, and the unique effect this has on the characters. Now, if you haven't already got a copy, you can buy it from the RedDoor Book Shop online with free post and packaging from the UK. And RedDoor will be donating £1 from every purchase to Alison's favourite charity, Médecins Sans Frontières. It's also available from the Book Depository with free post and packaging for overseas. I'm delighted that Deborah will be shortly introducing Alison to you all. Professor of Public Policy at Birkbeck College, Deborah is a political economist in the mould of James Cameron, the father and philosopher of the book's title. The author of numerous journals and academic publications and a New Zealander by birth, Deborah has spent years working in and around Gower Street in London, the setting of the first third of the novel. Maggie Hammond, who will be in discussion with Alison a bit later on, is a novelist and non-fiction writer and the winner of the first World One-Day Novel Cup. Maggie holds a PhD in creative writing and lectures at the University of Hull. Her latest novel, Virgin and Child, was published by Barbican Press in April 2020. Now, without further ado, I'm delighted to be handing over to Alison.
Thank you, Heather, for that lovely introduction. And I just wanted to say hello to everyone, and old friends and new. I can't see you because I've switched off gallery view, but I know you're there. And I'm delighted that we're able to have a launch of my novel rather belatedly, which was published back in April. And then our plans, like so many other people's, were upset by the pandemic. I also wanted to, I just want to say a word, first of all, about Deborah. I met Deborah many years ago, I won't say decades. Deborah was a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford College and at Oxford University, and I met her in Bristol in Berkeley Square, as I recall. And we've had a long friendship subsequently. And Maggie, I met a decade and a half ago when she organized a writing retreat in France. And who can resist going for a writing retreat in France with Maggie? And that's where we met for the first time, and we've been friends ever since. And I'm so grateful to you both for being willing to take part in this launch and this celebration of my latest novel. Thank you. So over to Deborah now.
Thank you, Alison. I'm very happy to have this opportunity to talk about The Philosopher's Daughters. Alison asked me to say a few words and also to read you a couple of extracts. Let me start by saying something about my take on the book. I see it partly in a gentle way as being a contribution to the rewriting of Australian history in the period of settlement and federation in the 1890s. The writers of this history have first and foremost been men, and they have written about men, which is of course true of almost all history, but there's a very distinctive maleness to Australian settler history. It's not without its charms. The poet and novelist Banjo Paterson, author of Waltzing Matilda, was a leading exponent of a genre of graphic Australian outback poetry in which weedy blokes like the man from Snowy River accomplish heroic deeds, and the wealthy and pompous are nicely skewered. And the man from Snowy River gets an honourable mention in Alison's book. But her book is about women, and it conveys very well, I think, the fears and attractions that Australia held for white women of the empire at the turn of the 20th century. The philosopher's daughters, Sarah and Harriet, lead a comfortable middle-class existence in Gower Street in Bloomsbury. There's intellectual stimulation, but life in these tall terraced houses is narrowly confined. The daughters and their father are committed to the campaign for women to get the right to vote, an issue which illustrates how Australia might be seen as a land of promise, as South Australia introduced women's suffrage in 1894. So Australia offers great opportunities, but also dangers. Those dangers unfold in the storyline, and I won't spoil your enjoyment by saying too much about the plot. Instead, I'd like to draw your attention to the way in which the daughters' ambivalence about Australia is reflected in their relationship to the landscape, which is an inescapable presence, and the distinctive flora and fauna of the country also, and as has already been mentioned, along with, most importantly, its Aboriginal population. So the landscape is marvelous, it's stunningly beautiful, and early in the book, Henry, returned from Australia, describes it thus to Sarah, his future wife. He told her of the smells of the bush and the heat in the middle of the day, even in winter, and the sky a vivid blue and so deep one could drown in it. And then in the evening, the fingers of shadows creeping down the hills from the Brindabella range, and one by one the stars appearing. The sky was at first dotted with a sprinkling of them, but as the night wore on, great streamers of stars stretched across the sky, so bright you could travel by night without a lantern, even when there was no moon. If only you could see it, he concluded. And of course, now we know we want to see it as readers, and we will do so again soon enough. So eventually we arrive at the homestead of Dumbulla Downs, which is described unflinchingly as a collection of corrugated iron sheds in a sparsely treed paddock, brightly lit by the relentless sun. When Sarah's sister Harriet comes to join them, she travels first to the relative comfort of the residency at Port Darwin, and she has this experience. After dinner that evening, Harriet wandered out into the garden through which moonlight poured, turning to shades of indigo and silver the foliage that by daylight had seemed green and gold. The air was heavy and scented with flowers that were unknown to her. 3 purling luggers, solid shapes in the shimmering water, were moored not far from the mangrove-edged shoreline. She sat on one of the chairs on the lawn and listened to the distant shouts from the crew of one of the luggers. Presently, she heard the haunting sound of a didgeridoo, which seemed to be coming from the direction of Mindle Beach, its reverberation so deep that she could almost feel its vibrations. The didgeridoo was joined by a rhythmic beating of what could be wooden sticks. After a time, a mournful voice started to chant, a chanting that continued for some minutes in a restricted range of a couple of notes, until it suddenly rose up in a whooshing sound, almost like the cry of some startled animal, before settling back to its original narrow range of sounds accompanied all the while by the didgeridoo and the beating sticks. The chant was almost hypnotic, for it made her want to tap her foot and then to stand up and move, to stand up and dance. So she did that after a while. She got up out of her chair and stamped around the lawn. As she danced, she moved out of herself and looked down on herself, a tiny figure on the lush lawn of the government residency in this tiny settlement next to the Arafura Sea, on an isolated continent on a planet spinning through space. For she had been well educated in science and, by nature and nurture, was aware of the insignificance of man. As she danced and contemplated the vastness of space and the unimportance of man, it didn't occur to her that she might ever find this frightening. So Harriet then gets the train to Pine Creek, which is a beautiful journey. The train meanders through the jungle and alongside the billabongs with their water lilies. Sarah and Henry meet her at Pine Creek for the 5-day ride to Dimbulla Downs, and that is a grueling trip. The relentless heat, the dust, the mosquito bites, and the discomfort of trying to sleep are all graphically described. Harriet's reflections on the landscape become more ambivalent. She reflects that the immense emptiness sometimes seems like a tangible presence hemming her in. The blue dome of the sky looked so hard it felt confining. But they get to Dimbulla Downs station, and unimpressive as it is, it's a welcome sight. We've already been introduced to the cast of characters there, including the white cockatoos. Sarah has observed their daily ritual. They fly in every evening at around the same time. Now, as Harriet arrives, a flock of sulfur-crested white cockatoos flew in from beyond the settlement and descended upon the bleached skeleton of a dead eucalyptus tree by the billabong. Their plump white bodies jostled for space on the branches, as if they too were spectators watching the arrival. Almost like coming home, said Sarah. Welcome to Dimbulla Downs. And just one more extract, a key passage really, as Harriet's accommodation to Australia comes with recognizing the destructive limitations of white settlement, as in this passage. Riding back towards the homestead, she saw a cloud of white cockatoos in the distance, advancing fast, as if blown by the wind. Once the birds were overhead, their squawking drowned out even the sound of the river. Their bodies looked bloated, she thought, dispassionately, as if she was seeing this for the first time, far too heavy for their wings. It was a miracle they stayed aloft. Wheeling over the billabong, they seemed at first to be making for the dead tree, before veering sharply to the right and descending on the ghost gum adjacent to the camp. As of one mind, they methodically began to strip the tree of leaves and small branches and to discard those on the ground, so that in the space of just a few minutes, it was littered with debris. At last, as if bored by their own destructiveness, the birds moved to the dead tree that was their usual perch and began their evening ritual of jockeying for position. White people are like that, Harriet thought. We might destroy this country. Just one final thought. The novel derives a lot of its force from the dramatic differences between the narrow life of Gower Street with its intellectualism and the wide open Australian spaces with their inescapable physicality. Readers who know of Alison's other life as an academic economist might be tempted to find an analogy in the contrast between the narrow focus of academic life and the emotional engagement of writing novels. But I think this would be a misreading and more generally a misunderstanding of Alison's work as an economist and a novelist. It's a misreading of the novel because the Philosopher's Daughters do not reject Gower Street. Actually, they uphold its values, notably that all human beings are worthy of equal concern and respect. Sarah, more conventional, is a little worried at the likely response amongst their settler friends to the sharp letters on the infringement of Aboriginal rights that Harriet gets published in the newspapers. But she does not reject the values that the letters espouse. So it's a misreading of the novel to place Gower Street and Australian outback in too much of an opposition. And it's also a misunderstanding, I think, of Alison's work more generally. Because while the novel is a completely different enterprise to an academic article, some of the same underlying concerns are maintained, notably a quest for accuracy and clear expression. I don't think Alison as novelist is rejecting or even escaping Alison as economist. Instead, the novel can be read as a plea not to accept the constraints of a single safe identity. It is a story that rails against self-limitation, especially self-limitation born out of fear of the unknown. It says that you can be a Bloomsbury intellectual and an Australian adventurer. And its achievement also tells us that you can be an academic and a novelist. Out of that belief, Alison has produced a very interesting and enjoyable novel. Thank you, Alison, and congratulations.
Thank you, Deborah.
Thank you so much, Deborah, for that wonderful introduction. Now, I'd like to introduce author Maggie Hammond, who will be in conversation with Alison. Over to you both.
Hello, everyone. It's lovely to be here at this virtual launch. And I totally sympathise with Alison over the difficulties of launching a book in the middle of this pandemic, because I've had the same experience myself. And it's great that we can all be together in this way. And of course, the great advantage of this new way of communicating is that here am I in London and there is Alison in Australia, and we're both here, which is wonderful. And that really brings me on to the first question that I wanted to ask you about the novel, because I've never been to Australia. I've actually tried to fly as little as possible, and so that makes it quite tricky to justify a trip to the other side of the world in this time of carbon emissions and concern with global changes in climate. But I wanted to ask you a little bit about how, in fact, there's a very intriguing little thing in the afterword where you say that you had relied on your father's journals, Alison. And I wondered if the novel was based at all on your own family's experience and when your family actually went to Australia, and what similarities there were in their experience to the experience of your two main characters.
My father actually wrote a novel, and I've never read his journals, but I read his novel, which was published in 2002, called Up the Dusty Track, and that was set in the Northern Territory. And he talked at length about the Northern Territory. He spent some years there, and that was a tremendous influence on my sister and myself. Although I never felt any urge to go there until we went to Darwin for the launch of Dad's novel. And then I realized in Darwin how much racism there was up there. And I also fell in love with the landscape. And so I decided I wanted to write about both. And that set me on my way. But you asked about my ancestors further back, and on all branches of my family, they emigrated to Australia from 1860s through to 1880s. There were some middle-class people and there were some desperately poor people. And they went to Sydney and to Melbourne. And we've even got one who went to Queensland. And so they're all over the East Coast, basically. And they had very large families. And it always struck me, my mother spoke a lot about family, and it always struck me how strange it was that here we were, very English descent, stuck on the perimeter of this vast country so far from what my grandmother referred to as home.
That is
and
really,
I wanted, sorry.
I was going to say that's really interesting, because I think, as Deborah said, that contrast between London and Gower Street and this vast continent, it comes over so strongly in the novel, and that seems to be something that comes out of your family background.
Yes, I think it does. Yes. And my father was very much a rationalist also. But my mother, who was a scientist, unlike my father, who worked in the printing trade, my mother was a scientist, and she had that interesting contrast between rationality and heart. Very compassionate person. And I think she was way ahead of her time in her attitude to the Aboriginal people. So that's the family background.
That again is a theme, isn't it, that comes out in your novel. I was also thinking about, because I've never been to Australia, I particularly loved the way that you did portray nature and the landscapes. I actually almost felt at times that I was there and that I could see it and experience it. So that was very powerful. And I guess that there is that sense of you knowing that world and that landscape so well. But of course, you're setting your story in the past, and historical fiction presents particular challenges. And I've always believed that really solid research is essential for creating any believable world in a novel, but it's particularly important when you're writing historical fiction. So I wondered a little bit about the research that you carried out to write the novel, and in particular, whether there were any surprises, whether there was anything that you discovered that you hadn't anticipated, and whether that changed the novel in any way.
Well, I hadn't anticipated anything really beforehand. I just thought I should read history to get acquainted with that part of the country. And while I'd always been interested in things like when women got the vote in Australia, I mean, who could not be interested in that? And so that was not a surprise. And I was very fortunate because the Australian National University had a collection called the Northern Australia Research Unit in the basement of the Chifley Library, an absolutely fantastic collection of everything that had ever been written about the Northern Territory. And so I was able to mine that resource. And unfortunately, that was completely destroyed in 2018 when there was a big flood, which wiped out the lower part of the Chifley Library. But so it was lucky I'd done my research before then. Also, I did a lot of reading of the Northern Territory Times and Gazette. And I had a research assistant who went to the National Library and she photocopied the Gazette pages. I gave her a list of things I was interested in, she could photocopy those. And then I also went up to Darwin a few times, and I went to the library up there and I read letters and so on. So I did very extensive research of Australia. Sydney was fine because I grew up there. I knew all the areas that were in the book. And London, of course, I knew because I lived and worked near Gower Street for some years. Although I did have to do some background reading for the level of poverty and the poor laws and so on in London. But I'm married to an economic historian, and I love reading history. I always have. So it was a pleasure, not a pain doing all that research. It was my leisure activity.
It sounds as if you did a huge amount of research. I mean, can you, over what sort of time period was it that you were writing the book? And can you sort of say how many years of research you spent?
Well, I can't really, because the thing about the research is, well, I began in 2003. I began reading Ernestine Hill's book, The Territory, and then I just carried on reading and writing. But this book, this novel, has taken the longest to read of all my books because of it's not because of the research, it was because of the Indigenous issues, Indigenous rights. And I wanted to get that in a form where it was not going to be offensive to people. One has to tread very carefully, naturally, quite understandably. And so I was a little bit anxious about that for some time. I've got a very good friend at ANU who is Professor of Indigenous History, and she gave me some advice. So that was the main issue, really, that made me so slow, I think, in writing this. And as I did many drafts, I did about 25 drafts, I think 25 drafts.
Goodness, yes. I mean, that's another issue as well, isn't it? That it's quite difficult when you're writing historical fiction, because even the vocabulary that people used then is not really acceptable now. So how did you deal with that? Because obviously when people are talking in your novel, they're not going to be using 21st century vocabulary. They're going to be using the words that people used at the time.
Yeah, that's a very difficult issue indeed. And in the novel, there are some words that we would view as very offensive, but I always use those when someone's speaking. So that doesn't appear in the text. It's in in quotation marks when someone's speaking.
Yeah, yeah, because you have to be true to how people did think and talk at that time.
Well, I did have to censor quite a lot of it, actually. So it was a fine balancing act, really. How much should I include of the offensive language, and how much should I leave out? And it's compared with some other writing of that time period, it's a very measured, I think, amount of vocabulary, because I really don't think I could publish something with that extraordinary racist language, nor would I want to do that. But one thing I found very interesting was that there was a review in the Canberra Times of the novel, and the reviewer took issue with the fact that I had, in a nice way, used the Indigenous rights, which would never have been used in the 1890s. But the alternative, I felt, was using something like Aboriginal protection, which I didn't want to use because I don't think that would appeal to our current use of language. So there were these fine balancing things, and I think it was made particularly difficult for me in this context, because it wasn't just the history and the language, it was the sensitivity about Black and white issues.
Yeah, and then there's also the argument that we're hearing a lot of nowadays about appropriating experience, and that's quite tricky too. It can be quite a minefield. So you were obviously aware of that when you were writing as well.
Very much aware of it, yes. Yeah, yes, but I mean, I think all writers in Australia now, white writers, are aware of the fact that we've appropriated so much from the Indigenous that we can't possibly appropriate their stories.
Yeah.
And I don't think I did in this novel. I think that the line I was trying to stick to was to allow for interaction between the races without appropriating their stories. So it was always, the novel is always seen through the eyes of the two sisters. And they're very different, the two sisters. And so I think you get a nuanced perspective you know, you don't get, as if you had a single person viewpoint, you'd get a pretty one-eyed view naturally of what was going on.
I think Deborah sort of touched on my next question, really, which is that the two main characters' father is a moral philosopher. And I wondered whether you had based this character on somebody real. Did you have a particular person in mind as the basis for him?
Oh, yes, I did. But of course, he's nothing. My moral philosopher is nothing like the one who's my hero, who is John Stuart Mill. And one of the reasons why John Stuart Mill is my hero, well, he's super intelligent, of course, but he also wrote a wonderful monograph way ahead of his time called, within the 1860s, called On the Subjection of Women. And that book, I read it maybe about 15 years ago, and I thought, how wonderful, this is exactly what I think. Why aren't more people reading this? And so I did base James Cameron very, very loosely on someone like John Stuart Mill, who was a moral philosopher and a political economist. And if I may just say a word about economics, economics is really a branch of moral philosophy. And we could talk about that for ages, but I don't think this is the right venue for it.
Lovely. And I was also, as I was reading the book, I was very interested in the character, the two sisters, because they're quite different, aren't they? And wondering what you saw as the main differences between them, and how that tension sort of works its way through in the novel.
Yes, thank you for asking that question. I'm very fond of both sisters, of course. Sarah, the younger sister, I didn't really think about her much. She just popped into the book, and I really liked her. And she's a well-balanced person. And part of my thinking, which I think was subconscious, was that the attitudes and preferences of one's parents have an enormous effect, of course, on the children. And it can be a misfortune sometimes to be too close to one parent. Both of these girls lost their mother when they were very young. And so they were very influenced by their father and a bit by their aunt. And their father was Mr. Logic. And for Sarah, who was the younger daughter, she was never really close to her father, and she was very musical. Now, one advantage of music, if you're good at it, you can disappear for hours playing the piano, and you can effectively cut yourself off from what is going on around you. And she's a happy person, and that was easy to write. Harriet was more difficult because it took me a long time to realize that she's a character who is torn apart by working out what her identity is, because she's very intelligent and she's good at a lot of things. Had she been a man, she would have been a very good moral philosopher, probably with a chair at University College. But she wasn't, and those opportunities weren't open to her. And so she was, after her father died, she was trying to feel her way into what she could do. And so for her, it was a battle between heart and head in the book.
And the story itself is a battle between those two forces, isn't it, all along? Because, as Deborah said, you know, you have this sort of intellectual London background, and then you have Australia, which is quite wild. And you also have the idea of music and art, which is in opposition to it. And I was wondering whether, you know, there are some pretty big themes in this novel, although you deal with them very lightly. You never feel that they're being sort of pushed into the novel. They're just there as part of the backdrop and the time that the novel unfolds in. And so it seems like they're entirely natural. But you know, the themes about race and gender, but also these themes about the heart and the head. I was wondering whether these themes were the reason why you wrote the book, or whether in fact the themes arose out of the story. I was wondering which way around it was, whether you started writing because you wanted to tell a story, or because it was a way of dealing with these issues, which obviously are very important to you.
I think I'd need a psychoanalyst to be able to answer. I mean, there's no doubt that, a lot of my writing is intuitive, and I'm not quite sure I'm doing it, what I'm doing it, and why I'm doing it, until I start or doing the final draft, maybe. So I couldn't tell which order those came in. What came to me was just that I wanted to tell a story about the North and racism, and about how two young women with a very relatively modern upbringing might see colonial issues in those times. And then out of my subconscious come these other things that are important to me. And some, out of my own upbringing, I always felt when I was young, a conflict between logic and emotion, which is why I never knew what I wanted to do when I left school, because, science, maybe architecture, I didn't know about economics then, literature, you just don't know what you're going to do, and you get pulled in different directions.
That's interesting, because I have a background of having done my first degree in science and biochemistry, and my master's in theology. And maybe this sort of heart versus head thing interests me so much because it's been a very much theme in my own life, about how I've always viewed the world with a scientific eye, really, but at the same time, there's more to life than can be explained in factual terms. And so I thought, that description which Deborah read of the stars and the sky was just so beautiful, and sort of touched on a sort of sense of transcendence. And I think it's through nature and the landscape that I did feel a sort of almost spiritual or transcendent sense at times. And I was interested in that. And I wondered how you felt about that yourself, because obviously, of course, there's the discussion about art and the art of the indigenous people. So I was curious as to how you yourself felt about that sense of the spiritual.
Oh, yes, I absolutely agree with you that it's transcendent. Yeah. Yes, the landscape, nature, absolutely. Yeah. And
the landscape almost becomes like a character, I think. It's so present. It's as important to the novel as the characters are.
Well, the landscape changes Harriet. Her interaction with it is so strong, and it affects who she is, how she's developing. And so, yes, it's a character that really affects her. I think that the younger sister, Sarah, for her, the landscape, she moves along happily through the landscape, but for her, I think she sees, and so does her husband, what's dangerous in it. And hence her willingness to be able to shoot a gun, because she could see the dangers there that Harriet never saw.
And there's a sort of threat, isn't there, all the time in the novel, a sort of threat of violence, which at one point becomes very explicit. I found that scene quite shocking, although it's you know, written in a way that's not at all sort of gory or too explicit. I was wondering about that and about the effect that that also had on the characters, their relationship.
Sorry, what was the last part of your question? I was just thinking of how when I first met you, you were reading a draft of my novel of the time, and you said you must go away and write that scene head on, and you more or less, well, you strongly advised me to go away and confront all the issues of violence. And
Yes.
what you just said there reminded me of that.
Yes, so
Yes.
you did tackle it head on, definitely.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
yeah, that was very shocking, and I suppose that also highlights the issues around the treatment of women and women's status at that time.
Yes, yeah. Yes, I felt that scene had to be there.
We've only got a few minutes left before we're going to take questions. So I'm going to encourage people who are listening to put your questions to Alison in the chat so that we can deal with as many of those as possible. But I was wondering if there was anything particular that you wanted to say about your book, anything that hasn't come up in this discussion.
No, I don't think so. Thank you, Maggie. No, I don't think so.
I mean, I would really encourage everyone present to read the book, because it's that quite rare combination, I think, of a book that's beautifully written and has a great storyline, but also does bring up some quite important points. And I certainly loved reading it. And I think, again, in lockdown, it's wonderful to read books from describing different places, because it means that you can travel in your head, even if you can't travel physically.
There was one thing I did want to mention about the book, actually, and that is the law, the rule of law, because I think one of the things that Harriet was particularly struck with was how there was colonial law on the one hand, and then there was a system of laws that the indigenous people had. How part of the difficulty at the frontier was the reconciliation. Well, there never was a reconciliation, the conflict between those two. And of course, the indigenous people were always going to lose. And that was the thing that I found quite fascinating with my reading research into the frontier of Australia, which included the top of Queensland, the top of the Northern Territory, and the top of Western Australia, this conflict of systems of law, and the inability of the white people to see that the indigenous had their own, that they weren't a primitive people, they had their own sophisticated rule of law, which people of the time, European people of the time, just didn't see. So that was the last thing I really wanted to mention. And I think that comes across in the book.
Thank you, Alison. It's fascinating to hear you talking about the book, and I've learned a lot from it, so thank you very much.
Well, I think that's about all we've got time for today. Thank you everyone for your questions. It has been such a pleasure listening to this conversation. I hope everyone's enjoyed it as much as I have. I'd like to say a huge thank you to Deborah and Maggie for sharing your time with us today. And thank you, Alison, for sharing your lovely novel with us. As I said before, you can buy The Philosopher's Daughters from the RedDoor website with free UK post and packaging. But obviously you can get it online, and overseas is free postage with the book depository. So thanks everyone again, and goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.